The day my brother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "This house was never meant for you," was the same day I realized I had been too quiet for too long. I was 31 years old, standing in the living room of the home my late grandmother had left to me, in writing, signed and notarized. And my sister's husband was pointing his finger at me like I was a squatter. Let me back up. My grandmother raised me, not fully, not officially, but in every way that counted. My parents divorced when I was 6, and the years after that were a blur of missed pickups and forgotten school plays, and a mother who loved me in theory more than in practice. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was the one who showed up. She came to my science fairs. She drove me to swim practice at 6 in the morning. When I got my acceptance letter to college, she cried before I did. She was 78 when she died, and she left me everything. Not my mother, not my sister, me. The house, a 4-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburb of Charlotte, worth somewhere around $890,000 by last year's estimate, went to me. Along with her savings account, her car, and a handwritten letter that said, simply, "You were always the one who showed up. Now it's your turn to have something solid underneath you." I kept that letter in my nightstand. I read it more times than I could count. My sister found out about the will 3 days after the funeral. I had barely finished returning casserole dishes to neighbors when my phone started buzzing. My sister is 4 years older than me. We were never close in the way some sisters are, the kind who share clothes and call each other every day. We were polite. We showed up to the same Christmases. I knew the names of her kids. She knew where I worked. That was about the depth of it. But when money entered the picture, something shifted in her that I had never seen before. She called me twice before I picked up. When I did, her voice was controlled in the way that meant she was working hard to keep it that way. "I need to talk to you about Grandma's estate," she said. "Okay," I said. "I think there's been a mistake." I didn't answer right away. I was standing in my grandmother's kitchen, the one that still smelled like coffee and lavender hand soap, and I remember staring at the little rooster she kept on the windowsill above the sink. "There's no mistake," I said. "Her attorney went over everything. She wasn't in her right mind at the end, and you know that." That hit me somewhere behind my sternum. "She was sharp until the last month," I said. "You barely visited." The line went quiet. "We'll talk more about this," my sister said, and hung up. I should have understood then what kind of season I was walking into. I didn't. I thought it would be a few uncomfortable conversations, and then it would pass. I thought my sister, whatever her faults, would eventually accept what was plainly documented in a legal document and let it go. I was wrong about that in a way I still feel in my chest when the weather changes. The next few weeks were a slow escalation. My sister called my mother, who called me, who told me that the family felt the will wasn't fair. My brother-in-law texted me links to articles about contesting estates. My niece, who is 13, and should not have been involved in any of this, sent me a crying emoji out of nowhere one afternoon, which told me the conversations happening in my sister's house were not being kept away from the children. I tried to stay calm. I tried to be reasonable. I offered to have a family meeting with the attorney present so everyone could hear the same information at the same time. My sister agreed. That meeting was the worst afternoon of my life up to that point. My mother came. My sister came. My brother-in-law came, which I had not expected and which the attorney, a measured older man named Mr. Pemberton, noted with a slight raise of his eyebrow before saying nothing about it. My sister had also brought a woman I didn't recognize, who was introduced as a family friend and who, I found out later, was a paralegal at a firm across town they had prepared. Mr. Pemberton walked everyone through the will methodically. He explained the timeline of when it was signed. He noted the 2 witnesses. He explained the clause about mental competency and what would need to be demonstrated to challenge it in court. He was patient and thorough and never once raised his voice. My sister waited until he finished and then said she was manipulated. The room went very still. "By you," she added, looking at me. I had spent 25 years absorbing things quietly, and nodding and smoothing things over. This was the moment I understood that none of that had actually protected me. It had just given other people more room to operate. "That's not true," I said. "You were always over here, always cozying up to her, making yourself the favorite." "I was here because I cared about her," I said. My voice was steady. "I didn't know how. I was here because she needed someone and you were busy. She had dementia." "She did not have dementia." That came out sharper than I intended. "She had a mild cognitive decline in her final 6 weeks. Her physician documented it. The will was signed 14 months before that." My brother-in-law leaned forward. "You need to understand," he said, "that we're prepared to take this as far as it needs to go." "That's your right, Mr. Pemberton said, and the quiet authority in his voice made everyone look at him. "And if you choose to pursue a legal contest, the burden of proof will sit with you. The documentation here is clear, the timeline is clear. I would encourage you to speak with independent counsel before making that decision, because contesting a will that meets these standards is expensive and rarely successful." My sister's jaw tightened. "We'll be in touch," my brother-in-law said. They left. Mr. Pemberton waited until the front door closed, then looked at me and said, "Keep your records organized, all of them. And don't engage in any informal negotiations outside of this office." I nodded. "She was lucky to have someone consistent," he said. He was putting his papers back in his briefcase. He didn't look up when he said it, but I knew it was meant for me. I held on to that for a long time afterward. The contest notice arrived 6 weeks later. I will not pretend that receiving it didn't break something in me. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office and I read it twice, and then I just stared at the steering wheel for a while. Not crying. Just absorbing it. The particular kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from betrayal. From discovering that people you thought would have a floor somewhere don't. My grandmother left me a house, and my family was going to spend what should have been morning time fighting to take it from me. I called Mr. Pemberton. I called a second attorney, a woman who specialized in contested estates, who told me the case was solid, but that solid didn't mean untouchable, and we needed to be prepared. I went home that night and I started organizing. This was the part that ended up mattering most, though I didn't know it yet. I am a financial auditor. I have been one since I was 26. I am good at it. I am the kind of person who keeps receipts in labeled folders and reconciles my personal budget every Sunday evening and notices when numbers don't line up. It's not a personality trait I've always loved about myself. At social events, it tends to make me the person nobody wants to sit next to. But in that season, it was the closest thing I had to a weapon. I went through everything. Every visit I had logged in my calendar, and I log everything in my calendar. Going back 4 years. Every grocery run, every prescription pickup, every doctor's appointment, where I had sat in the waiting room with my grandmother and taken notes on what the physician said. Every text message between us, backed up and dated. Every card she had sent me, every card I had sent her. And then, because I am who I am, I went through the estate records. My grandmother had been organized in her own way. Not my way, but her way, which meant shoebox by shoebox in her office closet. I had offered to help her organize her finances twice in the years before she died, and she had declined, saying she didn't want me to see how much she'd spent on QVC. I had laughed. I hadn't pushed. Going through those shoeboxes now, 3 months after her death, I found something I hadn't expected. There were withdrawals from her savings account, recurring ones, over a period of about 18 months, to an account I didn't recognize. Not enormous, between $400 and $800 at a time, roughly monthly, but consistent. And the timing of them aligned almost exactly with a period when my sister had been, by her own account at my grandmother's last birthday dinner, going through a hard time financially. I sat on the floor of that office for a long time. I did not jump to conclusions. I am trained not to jump to conclusions. I made a spreadsheet. I documented the dates, the amounts, the account number on the transfer records. I cross-referenced the timing with everything I could find. Then I brought it to the estate attorney. She got very quiet when I showed her. "How did you find this?" she asked. "I went through the shoeboxes," I said. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Good. I want to be clear about something. I did not know for certain what those withdrawals meant. It was possible my grandmother had given my sister money voluntarily as a gift and had simply not mentioned it. That was possible. People do that. But it was also possible, and this was the thing I couldn't stop turning over, that someone had taken advantage of a woman in her 80s with some cognitive decline, and that the same people now claiming she hadn't been competent to write her will had been benefiting from that incompetence in other ways while she was still alive. That is a dark thought to sit with. I sat with it. The mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. My sister, my brother-in-law, and their attorney on one side of the table. Me, Mr. Pemberton, and my estate attorney on the other. A neutral mediator in the middle. My sister had not spoken to me directly in 2 months. My mother had been texting me every few days with messages that ranged from, "I just want everyone to get along," to "You need to think about what this is doing to this family," which I found interesting given that I was not the one who had filed a legal contest. I dressed carefully that morning, not to impress anyone, just because I have found that when I feel prepared on the outside, something in me steadies. We sat down, the mediator began. My sister's attorney opened with the competency argument, citing the medical records from my grandmother's final weeks. My attorney let him finish. Then she slid a folder across the table. It contained a letter from my grandmother's physician. Not the general notes from her final weeks, but a formal letter specifically addressing the date and circumstances of the will signing, which had occurred 14 months earlier. It stated clearly that at the time of signing, my grandmother had been assessed and found fully competent. It also noted that the physician had been asked to provide this letter specifically in anticipation of any future contest. My grandmother had known. She had thought ahead. She had prepared. I felt something come loose in my chest when I understood that. My sister's attorney studied the letter. He asked to confer with his clients. They huddled in the corner of the room for a few minutes. I watched my sister's face while they talked. She looked smaller than I was used to seeing her. When they sat back down, her attorney said they would need time to review the new documentation before proceeding. My attorney said that was fine, and that there was one additional matter she wanted to raise. She explained the withdrawals. She did not accuse anyone of anything. She presented the documentation, the dates, the amounts, the pattern, and she explained that we had retained a forensic accountant to review the full financial records from the period in question, and that we would be requesting those records be disclosed in full if the contest proceeded. The mediator was very still. My brother-in-law started to say something, and his attorney put a hand on his arm. My sister looked at me for the first time in 2 months. I looked back. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Her attorney asked for a recess. We stepped into the hallway. Mr. Pemberton bought me a coffee from the machine near the elevator, and we stood there without talking for a while, which I appreciated. 22 minutes later, my sister's attorney came out and asked to speak with my team privately. 40 minutes after that, we had a signed agreement. My sister withdrew the contest. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue the financial investigation any further, with the acknowledgement, formally documented, because I am who I am, that the estate was settled in full and without dispute. There was no payment. There was no apology. There was a piece of paper and 2 signatures, and then it was over. I walked to my car alone. My attorney offered to walk with me, and I said I was fine, and I meant it, mostly. It was a cold morning. The parking lot had those little puddles that freeze solid overnight and then look like ordinary wet pavement until you step on them. I nearly slipped twice on the way to my car. I stood next to my driver's side door for a minute and looked up at the sky, which was doing that specific gray thing it does in early spring, and I just breathed. My grandmother knew what she was doing. She knew who her family was, and she knew who showed up, and she made a decision with full clarity, and she documented it carefully enough that even the people who wanted to undo it couldn't. She protected me from across time in a way I hadn't understood until that morning. I drove home, I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the house that was now, unambiguously and in every legal sense, mine. I looked at the ceramic rooster I had taken from the windowsill above her sink. The only thing I'd removed from her house before the estate was settled, because I couldn't stand the thought of it sitting there alone. And I thought about what it means to be someone who shows up. It doesn't always feel like power. Most of the time it just feels like effort, like choosing the inconvenient thing because it's the right thing, like sitting in waiting rooms and keeping records and going through shoeboxes. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but it compounds. That's the thing nobody tells you. Every choice to show up, every receipt kept, every visit logged in your calendar, it compounds. And when someone tries to erase you, you have receipts. My mother texted me that evening. It said, "I hope someday you'll understand why we did what we did." I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and I didn't respond. There are things I hope for too. I hope my sister makes peace with the choices she made and finds her way to some kind of honesty about them. I hope my niece, who is 13 and has been watching all of this, learns something useful from how it ended. I hope my mother one day understands the difference between keeping a family together and keeping a family comfortable. But I also understand now that what other people make peace with is not my project. I have a house. I have a ceramic rooster. I have a letter in my nightstand that says it's your turn to have something solid underneath you. That's enough. More than enough. That's everything.